Hi, my name's Stephanie Hannam-Swain,
And I'm Chris Bailey.
and we're two disabled academics in COVID-19 autoethnographic reflections on working practices in a time of crisis by two disabled UK academics. I am a full-time wheelchair user due to my impairment osteogenesis imperfecta, which is also known as brittle bones, which is a congenital condition with varying degrees of severity. Mine is severe. Due to increased risk and consequences of respiratory infection, I'm on or was on the UK government severely vulnerable list for COVID-19. I live with my mum, who is also listed as vulnerable, and we self-isolated for at least 12 weeks as per the government guidance.
So the things that are important for the purposes of this paper about me are that I am autistic. I live with my wife and two young children. My youngest child was added to the vulnerable list during the early period of the COVID outbreak, meaning that me and my family were isolating for the initial part of lockdown.
So, as you may realise, the UK higher education sector's response to the pandemic of COVID-19 led to sudden overnight changes in the working practices of university staff and students as campuses closed and teaching and learning moved online very suddenly. What we're doing in this paper is looking to illuminate the experiences of this shift away from traditional teaching methodologies from the perspective of two disabled academics. And we're doing this using autoethnography as our methodology, employing personal narratives to explore the impact of these recent events. We build on a limited amount of research that has been conducted in this area, although obviously now this is growing. But in relation to disability and COVID-19 pandemic in particular, this research is still limited. There have been numerous surveys looking at the impact of the shift towards working from home, which has brought about mixed results, but especially for those who are disabled, there seems to be a more positive impact than negative. However, before the pandemic, only 5% of disabled people were enabled by their employer to work from home on a regular basis.
Okay, our methodology that we used for this paper was autoethnography. Autoethnography is a qualitative method. The paper we wrote, we located really within what's often called emancipatory disability research, which shifts the focus away from the consequences of specific impairments towards the everyday structural and attitudinal barriers faced by disabled people. Richards emphasises the emancipatory nature of autoethnography as a method, as a means to resist being colonised by others and subjected to their agendas. Autoethnography amplifies marginalised voices, overcoming objectification in relation to disability. For instance, autoethnographic narratives have helped complicate reductive understandings of an autistic experience. As autoethnography is sometimes critiqued for a tendency towards self-absorption, we acknowledge that we experience this pandemic with considerable privilege. We have relatively secure non-furloughed jobs and do not work on the front line, and throughout the pandemic have had safe and comfortable homes. Nevertheless, given the risk of disabled people being forgotten, it's vital that disabled voices are included in discussions regarding this period. Worldwide, approximately 1 billion live with some form of impairment, which is especially significant considering that disabled people are likely to experience the most negative outcomes from the pandemic, also navigating discriminatory laws and guidelines. In writing our autoethnographic accounts, we have considered relational ethics, responding by obscuring the details relating to others. For convenience, we also, later on in the presentation and in the paper, draw out some of the main challenges and some advantages that we experienced and faced during this time. We acknowledge that these narratives can only provide partial representations of our experience, but hope that the honesty present within them makes them of value.
For this next part of the presentation, Chris and I are going to share our reflections that we made in the paper. Please do bear in mind that these were written at the back end of 2020 or middle to back end of 2020. So we were quite early on in the pandemic at this stage. So I was not initially concerned about the prospect of self-isolating for 12 weeks, as I have already experienced extended periods in the house, usually due to fractures or recovery from an operation, for example. For me, such periods are usually accompanied by mild depression, although I haven't experienced this during this crisis. When the official lockdown was announced, I'd already been stuck at home for 4 weeks due to intermittent strike action and my adapted car being repaired. My line manager's agreement that I could work from home until my car was fixed meant that I wouldn't have to suffer the anxiety and potential injury that relying on unreliable public transport brings. I hate making requests for reasonable adjustments, despite being within my rights to do this under the Equality Act 2010. It's not uncommon for disabled people to be reluctant to disclose an impairment or to ask for accommodations within the workplace. For me, this reluctance stems from negative experiences of doing so in my previous workplace and internalized ableism that tells me that I need to be at least as good as, if not better than, my non-disabled workmates to make up for any instances of perceived inconvenience I place on my workplace or colleagues. As Goffman posits, I, like many disabled people, try to ensure that my impairments and any resultant needs are as unobtrusive as possible to reduce the likelihood of workplace discrimination. In a world that relies so heavily on employees meeting increasingly challenging targets, productivity is valued above all else. In a sector where ableism has been described as endemic, for example, in Brown and Lee's paper, ableism is normalised and ingrained to such an extent that many reasonable adjustments that disabled people seek are seen as unreasonable by employers. For an example of that, do have a look at Kay Inkle's paper where she talks about ableism experienced in another UK university. Tchaikovsky calls this a sensible sayable, as the denial of the adjustment is positioned as justifiable and ordinary, resulting in disabled people feeling less able to ask for further accommodations. I feel fortunate that in my current workplace, my line managers and head of department have been supportive. Most of my requested accommodations have been granted in a way that hasn't made me feel like a burden. I've asked for accommodations gradually as my confidence in my workplace and management has grown and as my understanding of my needs in my current role has developed. My experience of working from home shifted my workplace expectations and enabled reasonable adjustments, which I hadn't considered before and would never have thought achievable. The initial couple of weeks of moving to remote working were extremely stressful. A combination of workplace and everyday life uncertainty coming together to make a perfect storm. I love my job, and this was the first time I felt as though it was all just too much. Too much information, too much uncertainty, too many expectations. This wasn't my institution's fault as such. They were having to adjust quickly in response to staff and students' needs in highly unique circumstances. However, this resulted in a deluge of daily emails, often with conflicting information. Stressed out students also emailed regularly with valid questions that I couldn't answer. On top of these stressors, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence released guidance for the UK intensive care doctors around how to decide if a patient should be admitted to an intensive care unit. This guidance suggested that my level of impairment would automatically exempt me from ICU treatment. This has now been updated to instruct doctors not to take long-term stable impairments into account for decision-making. However, the British Medical Association guidelines contradicted the updated NICE advice and reintroduced age, comorbidities and impairment back into the decision-making process. This meant that although ICU doctors shouldn't specifically take into account my so-called frailty, which was the fact that I can't live independently, they can still deem me as clinically not viable for ICU treatment due to my impairment and comorbidities. This left me, along with many other disabled people, feeling extremely distressed and unable to concentrate on work-related tasks. Not only am I officially classified as extremely vulnerable to this virus, I may not even get the necessary treatment to help me to recover. Staying indoors with no outside contact became imperative. I quickly noted that the distinction between work and home time getting blurred. I decided to set working hours for myself and stick to these unless I was making up time that I'd lost due to impairment or COVID-19 related stress. One of the main sources of workplace anxiety was learning the new technologies needed to hold lectures and seminars online. Not only did I have to get to grips with the new programs, but it soon became clear that the lectures I'd planned were no longer suitable for this medium. Not having any training in teaching remotely meant that redesigning these involved more trial and error than informed choices. Now that we've experienced a few weeks of this online delivery of teaching and communicating with colleagues, I have grown to like it. This isn't to say that there aren't issues, particularly for students who don't have suitable equipment or space to engage in online learning, but on a personal level, this new way of working is liberating. When working face-to-face with students, I have a personal assistant employed through the government scheme Access to Work. Although this is a great scheme, without the PA, it would be extremely hard for me to hold down my job. It brings another level of additional labour in the form of organisation and paperwork that most people don't have. I now no longer have to contact the care firm and request the hours that I need, which is always more complicated than it seems. Nor do I have to order parking spaces or fill out timesheets to send to Access to Work or get those timesheets signed by my line manager. These may seem like small tasks, but they take out time from my week, especially when things go wrong between myself and the care company or Access to Work. Equally, working from home enables me to tailor my day around my own medical and care needs, fatigue, student and workplace needs, and family life. Not having to factor in the commute to work has meant that I can rest for longer in the morning, and I'm experiencing significantly less pain and fatigue. During the summer of 2019, where I had time to relax fully and take an extended period of annual leave, I realised that work was increasing my experiences of pain and fatigue. But I wasn't aware to what extent. I'd felt that the trade-off was worth it. I didn't want to have to give up a day's work and pay, as I felt that this may also reduce my opportunities for progression. Although our department is flexible in that you can work from home on any days that you aren't teaching, it's rare that we get a completely free day to do this. Before this crisis, I would never have considered it a viable option to teach or attend meetings remotely. However, I now feel that although not unproblematic, online meetings and teaching can be very powerful, useful approaches. Team meetings have felt more constructive, more frequent, and timekeeping has been better. Making those meetings optional has provided the same sense of support as when we were in the office, but removed any sense of presentism.
Okay, so on to my reflections. After years of suspecting I was autistic, I was informally diagnosed during a period in therapy in 2018, a response to what I now understand as being what is sometimes called autistic burnout, resulting from a lifetime of masking my differences and failing to communicate my needs. I was referred for a formal NHS diagnosis, joining the notoriously long waiting list. I see autism as what Deleuze and Guattari might call an assemblage, unavoidably constructed from medicalized definitions, but also comprised of wider social and cultural understandings, drawn from the discourse around neurodiversity that emphasizes difference rather than deficit. My first diagnostic appointment with a psychologist coincided with the commencement of social distancing in March 2020. Like many autistic people, I have a tendency towards anxiety, a need for routine, and a strong dislike of uncertainty. So alongside the understandable stress around the global crisis and concern for the well-being of others, the prospect that my long-awaited diagnosis could be postponed became a major worry. Receiving a text informing me that I could conduct my appointment, but via telephone, was a mixed blessing. Many autistic people find using the telephone challenging. For me, phone calls often result in overwhelm, as my brain feels like it's having to reach a little bit too far to cope with the process. My workplace adjustments relate to differences around social contact, sensory processing, and routine. Challenge around nonverbal communication is a key feature of an autism diagnosis. My brain interprets facial expressions other than a smile often as hostile, making long sessions in front of large groups of students overwhelming. Sensory sensitivity is also a principal attribute of autism, with sensory and social overload being the main stimuli, I suggest, for my regular migraines. At work, I minimize sensory discomfort by relocating when the office gets too loud, bright, or busy, or when small talk is too uncomfortable. Like many autistic people, I process sound differently, mediating these differences with noise-cancelling headphones. I avoid physical discomfort by wearing clothes of my own choosing. I've also, with my line manager, addressed my anxieties around unexpected change and my need for sameness. Change is one of my least favourite states, and the disintegration of routine brought about by the COVID-19 response resulted in overwhelm and inability to focus on pretty much anything. Home working was always an option for me, but I usually worked at university to maintain a routine and to establish spatial and temporal boundaries between home and work. I strongly associate tasks with locations, recognizing home working as a privilege I couldn't fully appreciate. Having young children often means that home is busy and noisy, which makes it hard for me to focus on work. Whilst many people would appreciate not having to commute, I avoid the sensory and social challenges associated with unreliable public transport by cycling or running to work. Exercise helps my mental health, as does the associated period of time alone. I value my commute for fulfilling these needs, particularly as previous jobs have necessitated delayed anxious train journeys. Therefore, giving up my beneficial daily commute hit me hard. The buffer zone of my commute acted as a boundary marker between work and home, helping my brain to readjust. Now working from home, I lost my means of transition. Also fueling my anxiety was the rapid change in the nature of work arising from the abrupt shift to virtual teaching. Many remote pedagogical approaches tend to resemble complex phone calls. At work, I avoid using the phone, choosing instead to communicate via asynchronous methods, primarily email. My dislike of unfinished exchanges means I tend to respond rapidly, making me easily contactable without needing to lift a receiver. While remote audio communication with a single participant is challenging, meetings or teaching involving video and multiple participants multiplies the complexity. Eye contact via webcam and screen is still eye contact, and turn taking in virtual meeting spaces is perplexing. Transitioning to remote working also entailed an oversaturation of university policy and guidance on everything. The volume of communication from students also increased, many looking for reassurance or certainty in this bewildering new world. An overflowing inbox added to my overwhelm, and my inability to keep up made me feel further out of control. I found it impossible to regulate my emotional responses, and the emotional dysregulation during this period was heightened when one of my own children began a course of medication that left them immunocompromised. As such, we were forced into isolation for a period of 12 weeks. Again, boundaries were blurred, as this isolation initially involved leaving the house for multiple hospital appointments. At the point of writing this autoethnographic account, sometime in late 2020, I feel things had settled down a little bit. I'd achieved this by negotiating routines and adjustments with family rather than work, establishing rules for demarcating work commitments from family time to ensure fair participation in both. This also necessitated an acknowledgement of the impossibility of always separating these two commitments, as challenging as this is. I can even tentatively point to some benefits of this new way of working. My choices when working in lockdown were restricted and therefore simplified. Exemption from social context removed the need for hypervigilance, usually required to pick up on social cues. I've encountered fewer sensory issues, meaning that instances of migraines reduced, although my family life still brought with it a supply of sensory stimuli. The complex and often repetitive embodied movements used by individuals for self-stimulation are often called stimming. For me, this involves repetitive hand movements or pacing about a room. Released from social expectations of having to physically perform office work, I am more comfortable to enact these movements at home. There's no colleagues to confuse when I find myself perched on my chair, flapping my hands or laying on the floor under my weighted blanket. I also established a routine of daily socially distanced running that replaced my commute, helping to regulate my sensory system. I haven't missed the challenging social expectations of office work and maintain social contacts via text through apps like WhatsApp and Twitter. Sometimes small changes disproportionately gave positive outcomes. Buying, for example, a pin board at home was key to demarcating the liminal space at the end of the landing in my home as my home office, helping to register this as a place of productivity. My aphantasia prevents me from using visual recall. This, coupled with my poor short-term memory, means I benefit from access to concrete information presented clearly, facilitated by this pinboard. I also appreciate not having to pack my bag for work, a daily routine which, due to difficulties with executive functioning, often feels like a mammoth task. At home, I have everything I need. In terms of teaching, some students are reluctant to attend live virtual sessions, but have reported that they appreciate the non-synchronous screencast approach offered by pre-recorded narration of lecture slides. I've also found students more eager to engage via email than the other options on offer. In terms of assessment, replacing face-to-face presentations with pre-recorded video submissions has rebalanced power relations that can manifest when nervous students present in front of lecturers. The fact that different pedagogical approaches suit different individuals can be forgotten with moves that seek standardization and uniformity.
Okay, so as you can see, taken together, our personal reflections illuminate the interrelated nature of work, disability and well-being. These are in turn complex networks of temporal and spatial, the virtual and physical, the local and the global, the cultural and the social, contingent on bodies, circumstance, things, feelings, senses and emotions. Both accounts reveal how work as a contextualized practice makes multiple demands on our bodies and minds. These demands are heightened for disabled people. Although this may be most evident at times of crisis, we should remember that this is always the case. Lives extend beyond the immediate work environment, and although establishing routine and boundaries are important, lived experiences crosses these constructed boundaries on a daily basis. It should not, therefore, only be in the time of global crisis when the needs of disabled people are considered. This should happen as a matter of course.
Choice and flexibility are beneficial for all, and this period could be used as a stimulus for returning to working life post-COVID with a more informed understanding of need, challenge, and accommodation. We ask that we do not seek to return to normal, rather we use what we've learned to improve experiences going forwards. On an immediate level, we need to remember that there will still be those who are unable to return to offline teaching and learning, those who, because of their vulnerable status of them or family members, will be unable to attend physical campuses. We must ensure that staff in these situations don't feel the pressure to attend, given that they'll be able to continue, they will be able to continue with the virtual teaching and meeting practices that have been established as standard practice during this period. We also need to make online provision for students in these circumstances.
Out of necessity, the recent shift to virtual working has been across the board. We both noted how different aspects of this move have, after initial challenge, been beneficial. This suggests that rather than seeking to re-establish physical meetings and teaching for all, offering a more hybrid virtual physical approach is appropriate. Enabling staff to attend meetings physically or virtually should be an option, given that we have seen that there are affordances of the virtual. Similarly, it will be useful as well as necessary to provide some teaching online rather than considering physical teaching to be the default. This will take careful consideration to ensure that the needs of all are met, but let us not pretend that all needs were being catered for prior to this period of imposed change. We've proved during this period that flexibility and freedom from the social expectations and surveillance of the office does not lead to a drop in commitment, effort, or productivity. Rather, it empowers individuals to do their jobs with less discomfort. We will begin to emerge from this period of crisis. A focus needs to be on moving forwards rather than looking backwards, about designing new ways of teaching and learning that work for everyone, rather than an unthinking return to business as usual. We need to use everyone's shared experiences of this time and their enforced experience of challenge and of different ways of working as leverage, flexibility and understanding going forwards.
Finally, it's important to note that many of the anxieties and challenges caused by the situation we outlined could have been avoided if planning had been put in place and prior warnings about pandemics had been taken seriously by those in power. It's vital that there's not now a blanket assumption at either governmental or institutional level that we're fully prepared to endure similar disruptions in the future. Institutions must have workable policies in place, created in consultation with staff, that are ready to be activated. It's clear that more robust planning and anticipatory action is required at all levels that takes note of the needs of disabled workers in advance of such situations, rather than relying on a system that puts the burden of adjustment on the individual. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the paper, but in the paper we also outline in Appendix 1 a series of challenges and mitigations for each of us. We kind of summarize the main points that we felt were the benefits and drawbacks of working during lockdown, during the pandemic. We thought for the rest of this presentation, we might just have a bit of discussion together between me and Steph around some of the points that we raised there. This was written, as Steph said earlier, towards the end of 2020 and published in 2021. And we're now, as we talk, in April 2022. So we've been through a lot more of the COVID period than we wrote about here. So some of the things that we wrote in this presentation, we've got further reflection on, I guess. So how we're going to structure it is I'm going to just talk through some of the challenges and mitigations and advantages that Steph brought up in the paper, and she'll reflect on some of those and how she feels now about those, and then we'll swap and Steph will talk to me about those. Is that all right, Steph, if I
yep, that sounds good.
I go ahead? Okay, so as you can see in the paper itself, this is positioned in Appendix 1 as challenges and mitigations, and then advantages. We'll start with some of Steph's challenges that she talked about, and then ask Steph to reflect on those. So in your challenges column, Steph, column, you talk about challenges being transition to sudden home working led to really high stress levels. Sudden transition to digital learning led to intense pressures to learn new skills really quickly, and the uncertainty that those skills would be valued as the information would change rapidly. You talked about the public health guidelines suggested that some disabled lives would not be considered for treatment purely due to frailty and the stress and worry around that. You talked about the blurred distinction between home and work. And you also talked about how you were worried that students didn't have the equipment and infrastructure for online learning. Okay, mm-hmm. So basically you were talking there about stress, about transition, digital skills, the worrying policy around disabled health, and then concerns around students. Are there any kind of reflections that you've got now when you think about those things, about how those things did play out, or how your ideas of those have changed over time?
Yeah, I think now that we're kind of supposedly coming out of the pandemic, this automatic reverting back to what we did before, I think we are seeing being played out, both within the institution and society more widely, which is really disappointing. Such as conferences being pushed, oh yeah, great, we can go back to being in person, and then if you challenge that, it's actually we'll add some kind of hybrid element, but it's only when challenged again. So again, disabled people's needs are still being an afterthought, even though we've seen the benefits of that hybrid nature of working, which is really disappointing. I think with that, now that we know that we can teach online, so for example, if it's really snowy here, I wouldn't be able to get onto campus. So as before, I would have kind of worked from home but cancelled any lectures or seminars. now I would probably just move that online. But there's still going to be that element of stress, I think, still there, in that, of course, the lecture or seminar planned would need to be altered quickly. So I don't think that will completely be eradicated just because we've done it before, and that needs to be acknowledged by workplaces. And in terms of, we now know all these new programs, but I think embracing the technology and keeping it there, not as just the one-off alternative, but making sure that institutions value our time and put value into training us on new programs and keeping our digital skills for staff and students up to date is going to be really vital. So that if we do go into another pandemic, you know, we're going to automatically fall back onto the programs and things that we know, but actually they may not be the best ones anymore. You know, if we have another thing happen in 5 years' time, it's no good institution just going, oh, well, we're done with that now. We don't need to invest in those things and that kind of training. We need to keep that up as well for students. You know, as I said, it's really difficult when students don't have the equipment and infrastructure for online learning. And for me, that's the main reason why students don't like it, because of the problems with it. But for me, institutions need to be thinking, well, actually, online learning opens the doors to so many other students, and students do have lives. They're not just these young 18-year-olds that have no responsibility and drink all the time, as is the potentially traditional view of a student. Actually, they've got stresses and commitments, and having an online option to come to a session or see the video afterwards is still really valuable. But they need the equipment to be able to do that as well. So I think, you know, again, more investment in access to IT equipment and stuff for students, it would be really valuable.
In terms of advantages, at the point of writing this, you wrote about advantages of working from home, working online, included a reduction in the additional labour in terms of having to coordinate your support needs in the workplace, the ability to tailor your working day to accommodate better your work-life balance, taking into account impairment effects such as pain and fatigue that you experience. You've been experiencing during the period of working at home less pain and fatigue due to not having to commute to work. And you also said that more frequent optional online meetings provide a sense of support, but reduce the physical problems of having to be in a room on campus. So a lot of those advantages you seem to feel result in your increased physical feeling of well-being. I assume because you're continuing to work at home at the moment, that's still the case. And I just wonder if you've got any reflections on that at this point.
Yeah, I think it is still the case. I do worry that now that I've had kind of 2 years working from home and not leaving the house still for weeks or days at a time, the transition back, even if I manage to keep a kind of hybrid way of working, is going to be really difficult. So then that'll become a challenge again. But yeah, I think the benefits of working from home and being able to keep doing so at least a couple of days a week, so that meetings, again, hopefully will have that online option, are going to be really valuable. I do worry though that, so to be fair to the institution, again, my line manager has said that they'll support me to try and do that. But I worry that that's theoretical. And when it comes to actually everybody being back and it, you know, being back teaching in person, you know, then you'll have meetings outside your teaching hours, and then it'll be like, well, actually, I do need to go in on that third day and that fourth day. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that goes.
Okay, thank you. So as time goes on, we're still, I mean, as we speak, in some people's minds, we're through this pandemic, and we obviously need to remember that we're not. It's still there. Several people are still full-time working. You know, even in our small department, people are still needing to work at home because of the risks. So while those of us who can come in have been doing so a little more. We're still very much in a pandemic, regardless of what the government or the institution might suggest. Okay, cool. Thank you for those reflections. That's interesting.
Okay, shall we move on to yours?
Go on then.
Okay, so some of the challenges that you picked out at the time then. Disruption of expectation around diagnostic process for autism leading to anxiety. Additional sensitivity resulting from working in terms of the family environment. Overwhelm and anxiety around unexpected change arising from the pandemic. The redundancy of previously negotiated workplace accommodations. The association of particular tasks with locations. You also spoke about the lack of transition arising from removal of commute leading to anxiety, anxiety arising from abrupt loss of routine, and then the increase in volume of email correspondence from students and the need for online communication and the challenges of video calls. So a lot of that was around, anxiety due to kind of change, really, and new ways of working, and balancing those commitments between family and work without that clear separation.
Yeah, and when I think back on that period, actually, that was a specific period, a specific period in time, and I found it really hard. I was a bit of, I felt like I was a bit of a mess at the time, and with all the things going on, I think I wasn't the only person who felt like that, and the anxiety was, pretty bad around that time. Part of that was because I was actually going through the diagnosis process at that point, and it's now a couple of years on from that, and things have kind of, that's a whole different headspace for me entirely anyway. I was also diagnosed ADHD after writing the paper, and that kind of made sense of some things. So for me, it was the change of the pandemic, along with personal change, along with personal circumstances, one of my children being quite ill, having high support needs, and that making home not a place that felt conducive to work, because there were other things due to disability again, but not me, but my daughter, due to her specific needs, making home not feel like a place where I could work. As time's gone on, I've settled down a lot about my own needs, and I've established routines around my own needs. I'm in today in my office at work, where I don't have to be, but I've chosen to come in because that's still my preference. But actually working at home has become more part of my routine now. So I feel more settled around that. So for me, it was a mix of personal circumstances and then the kind of worldwide thing that was going on that led to that anxiety. And I think my anxiety around both has settled a lot because we're further down the line, and my personal experience has changed, or my personal circumstance has settled down a fair bit. And I'm much more familiar with working from home, and I'm much more familiar with online teaching. And we're also not in that panic situation where everyone is having to work out how we do this and everyone is sending you emails. So I've calmed down and settled a lot, although I have my moments when new information is communicated. Things feel a lot different for me. I've also had COVID and got through that. And so that anxiety for me, I guess, has also passed, because we're now, when we were writing this, we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have other kind of, I guess, safety measures that we do now. And for me, that's a different feeling, I guess, to you, because I have had COVID, and that's not, although it wasn't nice, it's not massively impacted on me. And if I get COVID again, I'm likely to, fingers crossed, be all right with that. So my concerns for me personally are very different than they were when we wrote this. But I think a lot of the stuff still stands in terms of change for people, whatever that change is. I think our conclusions in the paper are really valid. We asked at that point that we don't seek a return to normal. And surprise, surprise, that's kind of the language that is going on now, a return to normal, both in the press and in institutions. So yeah, they're my reflections in terms of the challenges. I can see why things were so challenging, and also I feel like I've moved on a bit, but in similar circumstances those challenges would be the same for me.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. In terms of the advantages then, you talk about due to less emotionally tiring hypervigilance, you get less migraines. You've got more opportunities to physically be yourself, for example, to stim how and when you want. Less physical discomfort in terms of wearing even more comfortable clothes and what you want whilst you're at work. Some challenging organisational tasks no longer necessary. Choices being restricted and therefore simplified, leading to less overwhelm. And also non-synchronous, so pre-recorded sessions avoid challenging social aspects of the standard lecturing environment. Again, are you, now that you're kind of sort of back into work and you have done some teaching on campus, how do you feel things have changed, and do you still think those advantages are there when you do work from home?
Yeah, I think I'd stick with all of those advantages. I'd stand by those. I think again, due to the particular circumstances I was in at the time, I had only just been diagnosed autistic, and actually that is now something that I'm open about at work. So I'm not masking like I was. So I may be more comfortable to be at work than I was when I wrote this, and to be more myself at work. But there's certainly things about working from home that are beneficial. I do find teaching large groups of students emotionally draining. As much as I like it, I do find it emotionally draining, and that recording and putting things online has been really useful. Although I've reverted pretty much to face-to-face teaching, just having the facility to be able to put things online, like I did during lockdown, have much fewer or less migraines, and I've started having them again as things opened up again. I only had one this week, but actually missing some teaching due to having a migraine, but then feeling like actually it's okay to be able to record that teaching and put it online to replace that session. Even that has been really helpful because it's now an established practice. So even though my day-to-day teaching might not be online, having it as an option at different times to be able to put the odd session online has been really helpful, because it means that I'm not trying to cram in and make up sessions when I am ill. So the odd session going online as a recording doesn't feel like a compromise. It feels like actually that is a good piece of teaching. It's just delivered in a different way. And yeah, I've still got parts of my modules that have maintained a online presence, particularly the kind of non-synchronous stuff, which has been useful. So yeah, the reduction of the social expectations predominantly around teaching has been a positive, but I do still appreciate having an office space where I can come in and get on with stuff and then go home and do family stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the challenges are going to be then, let's say, in the next 2 years, with the situation in the UK seems to be that everything's just opened up, and unless the virus got significantly worse, we're not going to have any more lockdowns or anything like that. We just have to live with it, as they say. What do you think the challenges going forward are going to be, seeing as well as the virus seems to be being more and more transmissible? So do you think there's going to be challenges through that and continuing working? And
yeah, well, I think partly the challenges are going to be great for people unlike me, disabled people who are immunosuppressed or have compromised immunity, and are expected to just come back into the workplace and just put up with the fact that they may get ill, and that could lead to them being very ill. So challenges for people unlike me, I guess. Generally, because we know that COVID, you can repeatedly get it, and even with vaccines, it's still not very nice. It leads to periods of illness. I can see without further mitigation, there's going to be people off sick maybe more frequently. People seem to have already kind of dropped wearing masks, not necessarily just within the institution, but I mean in supermarkets and other places. I would have hoped at the end of, well, there isn't an end of this, but I would hope as we draw to a position where things are opening up more, people would be more conscious about their health and maybe the benefits of wearing masks and that kind of thing. I'm not sure that's been the case. It would be nice to think that we would all be less or more aware of how illness is transmitted, and therefore make sure that we do kind of stay at home if we're ill and wear masks and those kinds of things. I'm not sure that's the case. But yeah, I guess I'm fairly pessimistic about the challenges that people will face. How about you? What do you feel now? Because you're still predominantly or almost exclusively working from home, but you're now in a position where you're talking about and thinking about coming back in to do teaching. How are you feeling about that in the future?
Yeah, I'm in a really weird position because being on the clinically extremely vulnerable list, you would assume going into this next stage that I'd automatically be eligible for antivirals and all that kind of stuff. And yet I'm not. It is only for those that are immunocompromised, more or less. So on one hand, and also I've got disabled friends in a similar position who are going out more than me. So you kind of have that social pressure on one hand, and you're kind of thinking, am I taking this a bit too seriously now? Is it that bad? Should I start going out? On the other hand, you have your doctors telling you, like, it's not more likely to go bad for you, but if it does go bad for you, it's not going to be a good outcome. It's quite hard to weigh up. But I think my mind now is that I will start trying to come back onto campus gradually over the summer, come into certain meetings and kind of open myself up that way. And I have to say, to give credit where credit due, our department has been really supportive of me, and I haven't felt pressure to come in. But I feel that it probably is the right time to start doing that. But that comes with a lot of nerves and worry about how that'll play out, how I'm going to react in a classroom. Can I ask students to put masks on in September? Will they respect that? All that kind of stuff. I think overall, I'm a bit like you. I'm disappointed with how society in general has just kind of gone, oh, it's over now. Let's just go back to normal. And we don't seem to be taking the positives that we learn in terms of digital access to things, that disabled people are still having to remind people, what about this accommodation? It's positive in that generally you get a, oh yeah, okay. Whereas before it would have just been, no, it's not possible to do. But I think in society more generally as well, disabled people's rights and access have been rolled back due to the pandemic. Like, you know, politically, that's a different story. And it was kind of going in that direction anyway, but the pandemic's exacerbated that. And you get a lot less access because, you know, safety measures and things have taken over disabled spaces, and then they seem to have just stayed taken over, and there seems to be more of a reluctance to invest, I guess, and make those access options available.
Okay, so I think we'll leave it there. Thank you to anybody who has watched and made it through to the end of us talking. We were meant to be doing this live, but due to kind of COVID, we've ended up doing it like this. So if anyone has made it through to the end, thank you for watching us. And there's a link to the paper on the slides and also our contact details if anyone wants to give us a shout at any point. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks, Chris. Bye.